How do we measure happiness?
It's a really good question. It's actually, as a professional, as a psychologist, it's actually much harder to answer than most people realise because, there are multiple answers. So the simplest way to measure happiness is to ask someone. You can simply say, are you happy? Or how are you feeling today? Or something like that. And that's, although that's incredibly simplistic in a lot of ways, it's also a pretty good measure. Like we know the answers that people give are pretty valid. However, it's obviously it is an oversimplification, and it's not necessarily the way that most of us think about happiness. When we think about happiness, and certainly as a positive psychologist, when we talk about happiness, we tend to talk about it in a much broader sense. So what that means is that there are actually much more sophisticated versions of measurements of happiness. And in fact, what people probably don't realise if they're not psychologists is there are hundreds of measures, there are hundreds of questionnaires and surveys that either measure happiness in a broader, more complex, sophisticated way, and or measure the subcomponents of happiness, of which there are several, like meaning and purpose in life, or the quality of our relationships, or things like hope and optimism. So yeah, I suppose the answer to your question is there are multiple ways to measure it. It's not necessarily that any are better or worse than the others, it's just that they measure different things. So I guess if you are trying to measure it, you need to know what you're measuring and then what you'll get out of that.
And so do you think that sort of mechanism through which we measure happiness ourselves sort of changes over time as well? I mean, the way that we rate our happiness, and I guess even in the context of, are we talking about being happy in our lives or being happy with our lives? And almost the question changes your subjective response in the instance that you're asked day to day.
Very much so. So to go back to what I said earlier, if you ask that simple question, if I said, are you happy, or how happy are you, that's measuring a type of happiness that we would tend to refer to as a positive emotion. So happiness in that sense is one of many positive emotions, like joy and contentment and satisfaction and pride, and those sorts of emotions, positive emotions, which are good obviously, but they tend to be quite fleeting. So that can change, as you kind of hinted at in your question, that can change from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day. And that's why, so a positive psychologist or an academic would probably be more likely to ask something like, taking everything into account, how happy are you with your life overall? And that's a much broader measure of what we might call quality of life or life satisfaction that tends to look beyond those fleeting emotions. So it doesn't, maybe something crappy happened to you 5 minutes ago, you spilt something on your iPad, or but it goes beyond that, those minute to minute, day to day hassles, of which we all have many, and it's a bigger picture. So what I might say, even though I've had a crappy day, my life's pretty good. And so my answer then would hopefully reflect that. And there's all sorts of, again, a whole range of other questions in between and above and beyond that can assess it in a slightly different way.
To check out the full interview, there'll be a link somewhere. I'm sure you'll figure it out. You're an adult, presumably.